Okay, we're live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 March Research Showcase. My name is Martin Gerlach. I'm a research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation in the research team. It's an honor for me to introduce. Now we're live. Okay, then I start. Oops, that was my fault. I heard the video too. It's an honor for me to introduce today's speaker. We have Danielle Bassett, who's professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She pioneered the field of network neuroscience, the study of human brains using methods from networks, physics, and complex systems. She has won numerous awards for this work, most notably the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship in 2014. And since then, the scope of her work has expanded to study biological, physical, and social systems. And I'm really happy that some of this has touched the universe of Wikipedia when studying human curiosity, which is the reason why we invited her to give the talk today. And I will not say more about that, leave that to the speaker. I want to highlight that at the end of the talk, we'll have ample of time for Q&A. So if you have a question for the speaker, please put it in the chat, in YouTube chat or in IRC. Isaac Johnson, my colleague, will take these questions and refer them during the Q&A. And before I pass it on to the speaker, I want to give it to Miriam, who wants to make an announcement about Wiki Workshop, I think, and to Leila, who wants to say something about curiosity from Wikimedia perspective.
Yes, hi everyone, my name is Miriam. I'm one of the scientists in the team. I'm here to do a bit of propaganda for Wiki Workshop 2021. This is the annual gathering for all of us researchers interested in Wikimedia spaces. It's going to be held on April 14. It will start at 5 a.m. Pacific time, which I believe is 12 UTC, but please double check. We have open registrations today. Registration is, I believe, free. So please, I will put the link in the chat for registration, and maybe I will put also the website so you can see more information about the Wiki Workshop, and looking forward to seeing you all there.
Thank you so much, Martin and Miriam. My name is Leila Zia, Head of Research at the Wikimedia Foundation. I am going to just very briefly speak why we are in Wikimedia Foundation interested in the topic of curiosity and why people come to Wikipedia to learn. As some of you know, starting roughly around 2016, we started a line of research to understand why people come to Wikipedia, what are their motivations and needs when they come to Wikipedia. We did research to understand the effect of or the interactions between the demographics of readers, the geographies of readers when they come to Wikipedia, the languages that they speak when they come to Wikipedia, and what they seek on the projects. These were a series of mixed method research, both qualitative and large-scale quantitative research. A question that from day one was very interesting to us, and we couldn't tackle it because we knew very little back in 2016 about readers, was how do people learn on Wikipedia, and how can Wikipedia as a platform or other Wikimedia projects help Wikimedia readers to become more curious, more inquisitive about the content that they read on Wikipedia. Over the years, as some of you know, we have started another branch of research focused on knowledge integrity, and particularly the issues around misinformation and disinformation. And the curiosity and ability to learn and be inquisitive comes as a topic when we talk about misinformation as well. So here the idea is that machines can only do so much to alert the systems and the humans about the issues that may exist with regards to the quality and reliability of content. But there's also perhaps a responsibility on the side of the reader to become more inquisitive. And the question is how and if we can use Wikipedia to help readers become more inquisitive. So I'll stop here. Just hopefully this kind of bit of framing can help you understand how we ended up here. I'm super excited to hear from Danielle about what she has to share with us. And with this, I'll be quiet. And Danielle, please take it from here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about some of the work that we have been doing in this space. And we're very grateful for all of the people who have helped create Wikipedia and continue to help it to thrive in the way that it is right now, because it has allowed us to ask interesting questions we could never have asked before. So just to kind of start off here, what I want to do is to talk about the curious human. And we all know that the human mind inside of each of us is curious. It's curious in a lot of different ways. It's strange and remarkable and mystifying. It's also eager and probing and questioning. Despite its pervasiveness, though, and its relevance for our well-being, curiosity itself remains curious. It remains far from understood. In this talk, what I want to do is to integrate historical, philosophical, and psychological perspectives with some techniques from applied mathematics and statistical physics to study individual curiosity and then to study collective curiosity. In the former, I will evaluate how humans walk on the knowledge network of Wikipedia during unconstrained browsing, and in doing so, we will capture idiosyncratic forms of curiosity that span multiple millennia, cultures, languages, and timescales. In the latter, I will consider the fruition of collective curiosity in the building of scientific knowledge, as encoded in Wikipedia. And throughout, I will attempt to make a case for the position that individual and collective curiosity are both network building processes, providing a connective counterpoint to the common acquisitional account of curiosity. Now, what is curiosity? When I pronounce that term, several images may come to your mind. Perhaps you think of the classical board game Trivial Pursuit, which quickly takes you to the terrible trivium in the Phantom Toll booth. Or perhaps you think of the 2-year-old child asking an unending string of questions, or the beautiful sight of hands raised in a classroom. Perhaps curiosity is the love of trivia, and perhaps curiosity is the asking of questions. But I think we can probably all think of curious individuals who perhaps do not enjoy playing Trivial Pursuit. They're curious in a somewhat different way. And I'm sure we can also all think of curious individuals who do not verbalize many questions because they are relatively shy or thoughtful. There is a curious child in every classroom who is not raising their hand. So these examples of sort of definitions of curiosity perhaps leave something on the table. Well, perhaps when I pronounced the term curiosity, your mind went somewhere else. It's like, for example, to this wonderful piece from Norman Rockwell, which paints an amusing picture of the basis of curiosity for social information, the chain of gossip. Or perhaps your mind went back another century to Australian artist Jane Sutherland's picturesque piece, which paints a different picture of curiosity, again for social information. Or perhaps your mind went back even another century to the British Museum's Tittle Tattle, or the Several Branches of Gossiping, which offers a satire on women, unfortunately, childbed, church, the market, public baths, the conduit, and washing clothes in the river, the bakehouse, and the alehouse. They're all shown as opportunities for women to exchange gossip. This shows kind of a gendered and also evaluative connection to curiosity that may or may not be relevant today. So what is curiosity? I think I'm going to set some of those very gendered and valued-based structures aside and start fresh. What makes a human curious? The quandary of how to define curiosity and its places and its actions is not a challenge that we newly face. Instead, it's been faced by many before us. So for example, Augustine in 397 wrote, "Curiosity is a lust to experience and find out." Aquinas in 1270, "Curiosity is the desire to know." Descartes in 1649 writes that curiosity is a desire to understand. John Locke in 1693, "Curiosity is an appetite after knowledge." William James in 1899 writes that curiosity is the impulse toward better cognition. John Dewey in 1933 writes that curiosity is an interest in problems provoked by the observation of things and the accumulation of material. Voss in 1983 writes, "Curiosity is a motivational prerequisite for exploratory behavior." And George Lowenstein in 1994 writes that curiosity is a feeling of deprivation produced by an information gap. Finally, Celeste Kidd, in 2015 writes that curiosity is a drive state for information. So what is it precisely that we are desirous of, impulsive toward, interested in, deprived of, or driven towards? The answers, knowledge, information, solution to problems, better cognition, are commonly thought of as items, which, when acquired, are satisfying to us as humans. In fact, the analogy between hunger and thirst and curiosity, as well as the analogy between food or drink and information, underscores this acquisitional nature of our common conceptualizations of curiosity. Moreover, we think of curiosity as valuable to us because when we acquire the item of information, our life gets better. Our uncertainty about the world is reduced, and we no longer feel deprived of information. But upon reflection, this acquisitional account of curiosity seems intuitive, but if we press it a little bit further, if we follow acquisitional actions of humans to play out upon the theater of our experience, we quickly come to realize that we're missing a key piece of the puzzle. An acquisition or a collection of informational bits does not constitute knowledge. Knowledge requires something more. Knowledge requires an understanding of the relations between bits of information, relations of cause, of correlation, and of consequence, to name a few. And as John Dewey writes, knowledge is a perception of those connections of an object which determine its applicability in a given situation. An ideally perfect knowledge would represent such a network of interconnections that any past experience would offer a point of advantage from which to get at the problem presented in a new experience. We can similarly consider the perspective of Henri Poincaré when he writes, "The aim of science is not things themselves, these disconnected bits, as the dogmatists in their simplicity imagine, but the relations among things. Outside these relations, there is no reality knowable." So we can ask the question, how might we expand the current acquisitional account of curiosity to an explicitly connectional account of curiosity? And if we did that, what sorts of affordances would a connectional account of curiosity offer? Well, the connectional account of curiosity casts curious humans as those that build networks. They build by adding nodes, items of information, and edges, relationships between information, as they grow their body of knowledge. And using a more embodied description, curious minds engage in a kinesthetic practice, a movement practice, by walking through knowledge space and picking up a relation here to structure their thought architectures. The knowledge network inside each mind is therefore constantly evolving, constantly growing in manners that are and directions that are idiosyncratic. We walk along these links to connect different bits of information, and then we stand at the void where we do not see anything, we do not know what comes next, and we shout across. With Walt Whitman, we think a thought of the cleft of the universe and of the future. And when we find or discover a unit of information that fully or even partially fills that void, we've built a new bit of scaffold in our knowledge network. So in this framing, we can then ask, what is curiosity's walk? Is there just one walk? Is there more than one walk? How are curiosity's walks similar to one another or different from one another? Which walk do we choose? Do we choose different walks each day? Lots of questions. To answer these questions, we worked with Professor Perry Zern, who's a philosopher at American University. He performed a historico-philosophical examination of the use of the terms for curiosity in English, French, German, and Latin over the last 2 millennia. The method that he used takes a common contemporary concept or practice and then traces its usage and meaning over one or several historical periods. From these data, he built a taxonomy of curiosity that's based on kinesthetic signatures or movements, and he refers to them as the busybody, the hunter, and the dancer. And I'll walk through each in turn. The first kinesthetic signature of curiosity is the busybody, and a good description comes from Plutarch in his book On Curiosity, where he says, "And the busybody, shunning the country as something stale and uninteresting and undramatic, pushes into the bazaar and the marketplace and harbors, asking, 'Is there any news?' A second example comes a little bit later, obviously from Martin Heidegger and his Being and Time, where he refers to curiosity as the not staying with what is nearest, the distraction by new possibilities, and the never dwelling anywhere. Interestingly, this kinesthetic signature suggests that busybodies enjoy building a knowledge of relatively disconnected units of information. Now, we can contrast the busybody with the second kinesthetic signature, which Zern refers to as the hunter. Again, from Plutarch's on Curiosity, he says, if you have to be curious, don't turn aside and follow every scent, but keep your sense of smell pure and untainted for its proper task. And from Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, the man of curiosity is described as wishing, quote, he had a few hundred helpers and good, well-trained hounds that he could drive into the history of the human soul to round up his game. And finally, from Jacques Derrida in The Animal That Therefore I Am, to be curious is to track, to sniff, to trail, and to follow some of the reasons for the so confident usage of words. The hunter is clearly curious, but in a strikingly different manner than the busybody. And interestingly, this kinesthetic signature suggests that the hunter enjoys building a knowledge of connected units of information as he or she or they move further and further towards the item of information that they are searching for. And now we can contrast both the busybody and the hunter with this third kinesthetic signature, that of the dancer. And again from Nietzsche, but now in his Gay Science, thinkers of the future are envisioned as, we do not belong to those who have ideas only among books when stimulated by books. It is our habit to think outdoors, walking, leaping, climbing, dancing, preferably on lonely mountains, or near the sea where even the trails become thoughtful. Our first questions about the value of a book, of a human being, or a musical composition are, can they walk? Or even more, can they dance? And from Michel Foucault's in his The Masked Philosopher, we have, I can't help but dream of a kind of criticism that would try not to judge, but to bring an avoir, a book, a sentence, an idea to life. It would light fires, watch the grass grow, listen to the wind, and catch the sea foam in the breeze and scatter it. It would multiply not judgments, but signs of existence. It would summon them, drag them from their sleep. Perhaps it would invent them, sometimes all the better. I'd like a criticism of scintillating leaps of the imagination. I dream of a new age of curiosity. Interestingly, this kinesthetic signature suggests that the dancer builds a knowledge of connected clusters of informational units. They build here and then they jump, they leap, they dance to another area of knowledge space. So from each of these kinesthetic signatures, or these walks in word knowledge space, we can note that perhaps curiosity is not what we are curious about. Maybe we're not curious about trivia or otherwise. And perhaps curiosity is not what physical actions we take, but instead curiosity is how we build knowledge from concepts, units, and their relationships. The busybody builds connected bits of knowledge, the hunter builds more orderly or targeted knowledge, and then the dancer complements the local order with long leaps into new conceptual spaces. So with this sort of framing in mind from the historical philosophical context, we can posit that as humans, as we move from book to book, or as scientists, as we move from paper to paper, or as citizens, as we browse Wikipedia, move from web page to web page, we are building knowledge networks. So what sorts of networks do we build? And do our preferences differ between us? These questions amount to asking how we are curious, not whether we are curious or how much we are curious, but exactly how. What is the nature of our curiosity? The work I'll describe over the next few slides was led by psychologist Dr. David Leyden-Staley, who is now a professor in the Annenberg School of Communication at Penn. So David began this study by inviting 149 human participants to browse Wikipedia for 20 minutes a day for 21 days. The participants signed a consent form allowing us to install some software on their laptop to track which Wikipedia pages they viewed and when. And across the entire study, a total of 18,654 pages were visited by each participant over 5 hours spanning 21 days. So that's a lot of hours of browsing for each person. Then what we did is that we built networks from their Wikipedia browsing. to sort of follow this idea of walking on a knowledge space. So we represented every Wikipedia page as a node in the network, and then we represented each edge between Wikipedia pages as the cosine similarity, which is bounded between 0 and 1, between all possible pairs of vectors of term frequency inverse document frequencies associated with the text of each page. So that's just a measurement of the similarity of the concepts. And what you can see on the right here of this slide is that we see individuals who browse quite distinct pages, and that's this person here, who's shown on the left-hand side. So notice the very dark colors. This means low similarity values as they step from page to page. And I want to contrast that with an individual who browses quite related pages, and you can see that here on the right-hand side. See the lighter colors or higher cosine similarity values? That means that this person is walking between very related pages. And then we see somebody, in between. But among the 149 individuals, we see a wide variety of whether they walk among pages that are related or very non-related. And now we're ready to assess the network structure or the pattern of connections between the concepts. And here what we do is that we use tools from network science, which is an emerging scientific discipline that studies the architecture, dynamics, design, and control of complex interconnected systems. For us, it's very useful because it provides a toolbox, including analysis methods and statistical metrics that can be calculated on these networks and then compared among people browsing Wikipedia. So what we can do is that we can translate that historico-philosophical taxonomy into network phenotypes. And we do that by hypothesizing that a hunter will build networks with very high clustering and low path length. And conversely, we hypothesize that the busybodies will build networks with high path length and low clustering. So what does this mean? Well, the clustering coefficient measures the probability that a node's neighbors are also connected to each other, and it can be thought of as the proportion of connected triangles in the network. So someone whose network has high clustering would visit related Wikipedia pages. In contrast, the path length, which we will also calculate, measures how many links need to be traversed to get from one node in the network to another node. And someone whose network has high path length would visit fairly unrelated Wikipedia pages, so very dissimilar pages. So this translation of the historical philosophical taxonomy into the network phenotypes allows us to operationalize these kinesthetic signatures we were talking about in the parlance of network science. And to formalize the link to curiosity even a little bit further, we make a prediction about what features of participant personality might track with these network phenotypes. We hypothesize that individuals who are high on what's called deprivation sensitivity would have a drive to eliminate the unknown as they encounter new information and recognize knowledge gaps. So therefore, individuals high in deprivation sensitivity would be hunters and with high clustering, while individuals with low deprivation sensitivity would be busybodies with low clustering. And we measure deprivation sensitivity by having each of the participants inside of our study fill out a questionnaire that's been previously designed to assess with a set of questions how sensitive they are to the deprivation of information. Now, we tested our hypotheses in the Wikipedia browsing data, and the results confirmed our hypotheses. So we indeed found that deprivation sensitivity, which is what you see along the x-axis here, the tendency to seek information that eliminates knowledge gaps, is associated with the creation of relatively tight networks and a relatively greater tendency to return to previously visited concepts. So here what you see is a correlation between the deprivation sensitivity and the clustering coefficient. So hunters are those that build networks with greater clustering, busybodies are those that build networks with less clustering, and that also correlates with whether or not that person is high on deprivation sensitivity or low on deprivation sensitivity. And on the right-hand side here, you're seeing the path length, again, as a function of deprivation sensitivity. Here on the left-hand side is the busybody, and then on the right-hand side is the hunter with a lower characteristic path length. So simply, individual differences in deprivation sensitivity lead to the creation of knowledge networks that have really distinct architectures, some very clustered, some very open or spacey or sparse or loopy. So when we seek information, each of us seeks it differently, constructing very different networks of knowledge. now. But an important component of this study is not only that we each seek knowledge differently, but we actually seek knowledge differently day by day. So what we did is that we separated the data into early, middle, and late browsing across that 21-day period. And we also measured people's sensation-seeking capacities as it varies from day to day. So some days we wake up and we are seeking new novel sensations, and other days we wake up and we don't seek novel sensations. So this is something that varies from day to day. What we found is that the days of greater sensation seeking than normal are days in which participants built more as busybodies and less as hunters. So when you're seeking novel information, you will build as a busybody, and when you are less sort of seeking of novel information, you will build more as a hunter. And so from these data, we can make an even further statement, which is not just that we seek information differently from one another, but also that each day we are differently curious than any other day. Now, that led us to build a computational model to sort of understand all of this practice more thoroughly. And so this computational model of kinesthetic curiosity generates walks on existing knowledge network architectures. In that model, we balance preferences to retrace the familiar versus explore the unfamiliar, and preferences to take short versus long steps. And with these two parameters, the model can predict the architectures of networks that people build based on their different kinesthetic preferences. We find that deprivation sensitivity is associated with retracing the familiar, whereas depression is associated with taking shorter steps on the Wikipedia knowledge network. The links between sensation seeking and depression and kinesthetic actions in knowledge space underscore the potential reflections of clinical factors in the way that we walk on networks. And collectively, I'd say that both the data and the computational model serve to reconceptualize curiosity as an act of connecting rather than a method of acquiring information. And to sort of press that point a little bit further, I want to move from the individual, which we've been talking about for the last few minutes, to the collective. And here, I want to note that humans are not only curious as unitary objects, but also in the aggregate. And the fruition of collective curiosity is a large collective knowledge. And what we wanted to do was to study specifically the fruition of collective curiosity in the network of scientific knowledge that Poincaré had mentioned in the passage I quoted earlier, that science is not things themselves as the dogmatists imagine, but the relations among things. We could also similarly point to Lauren Okun's Elements of Physiophilosophy, which he first published in 1810 and then was translated into English in 1847. And he notes in there that science is a series of necessarily interdependent and consecutive propositions. So these two scientist-philosopher hybrids, Poincaré and Okun, state frankly what we would all intuitively appreciate, that we cannot truly understand any item of knowledge until we understand its relations to other items of knowledge. And deciphering those relations is exactly what science is about. But that just knowing what science is about doesn't tell us how we do it. So we wanted to ask the question of how we do it. And if we go back again to philosophy as a starting point to kind of guide our questions, in the philosophy of science, philosophers have actually described patterns of scientific development in a couple different ways. And I'm going to focus on three today. So Thomas Kuhn, for example, talks about having two regimes of science. The first is normal science, in which a normal scientist simply solves puzzles within a paradigm. And then you have a paradigm shift, which is a revolution in which the model of reality undergoes some drastic change. Then another philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, proposes that science progresses as pure competition of ideas, and there's no characteristic pattern of scientific development. So it's a little bit sort of haphazard. And then another philosopher of science, the third that I'll talk about, is Lakatos, who balances the ideas of Kuhn and Feyerabend by suggesting a research program, which has a set of core postulates and then an auxiliary belt or periphery of hypotheses that go around those postulates. So what we wanted to do was to test these three different notions of how science happens as knowledge networks are built. And we again turned to Wikipedia to ask this question as a growing network of scientific knowledge. we were particularly interested in evaluating its time-evolving architecture. So what we did is that we began by treating each page as a node in the network, and then by treating each hyperlink between Wikipedia pages as an edge in the network. We then estimated the date for the main concept presented in the page by examining the history section and extracting the first year in that section. So using this method, we can create these very large concept networks for very different subfields of science. And I would also note that in this particular formulation, the concept networks that we're pulling from Wikipedia are not the commitments, scientific practices, and social practices that some of the philosophers discuss. When Kuhn and Feyerabend and Lakatos describe their theories, they have theories of those commitments and practices, and then they also talk about the development of new concepts. And what I'm going to say today is really just focused on that latter, the development of new concepts, not an examination of commitments and practices, which is sort of outside of, I think, what we can gather algorithmically from these kind of data. So let's ask what these three philosophers how their theories would sort of be operationalized in terms of network science, just as we did in the first study. How were these kinesthetic signatures operationalized in network science? So here we ask, well, in Kuhn's normal science, where scientists solve puzzles within a particular paradigm, one could see that the new concepts connect different parts of the networks together. So in network terms, what you might see as people solve puzzles is a high clustering of nodes as you sort of triangulate and understand, oh, this is what fits here. This is what was missing. And then in Lakatos's research program, he describes science as having a core of postulates and then an auxiliary belt of hypotheses. So we might imagine the presence of a densely interconnected core and then a sparsely connected periphery of those additional auxiliary hypotheses. And then in Feyerabend, in his thesis, where there's no characteristic pattern to science, we might see more of a random network structure of scientific concepts. So let's ask what the data say according to these three ideas. So first, we can quantify the network topology using the statistics that I've described before in addition to a few others, and we can compare what we observe to the true data to random network null models. So these are null models that have been sort of rewired to remove their structure. So first we measured clustering, which you can see on the left-hand side. It assesses the preponderance of triangles versus connected triples, as I noted earlier. In these data, we see that science concept networks, which are here in the data points, are much more clustered than random network null models. So that's important. That's a sort of mark for Kuhn. Next, we can measure modularity here and the presence of communities, where nodes inside of communities are more densely interconnected to one another than they are to nodes in another community. What we see in the data is that these science concept networks have greater modularity than expected in a random network null model of the same size. And then lastly, what about Lakatos's hypothesis that there might be a core and periphery structure? So we measured the coreness of these networks, which assesses the presence of a densely connected set of core nodes accompanied by a sparsely connected periphery. And again, you can see the data sits here above the unity line, indicating that these science concept networks have greater coreness than expected in a random network of the same size. So these data collectively suggest that real networks are very highly structured and not random. So to us, that suggests that perhaps there are some constraints in the process of scientific development pressing beyond Feyerabend's description. So we'll keep in play Kuhn and Lakatos at the moment. So let's consider first, between the two of them, the constraint that Lakatos proposed so that the periphery builds upon the core. In the data, we can actually measure whether core nodes are born before or after their neighboring peripheral nodes. And in general, what we find is that there's no evidence that core nodes are born before their neighboring periphery nodes. So this suggests that there's some additional constraints necessary. So here what I have is whether if the data lies on this side, that means the core was born earlier. And if the data lies on this side, it means a periphery node was born earlier. And the variance across these violin plots indicate the different nodes inside of the network. And what you can just see across these many different fields of science is that there tends to be a density of the data around the 0 mark, indicating that there really isn't a preference for the core to be born earlier than the periphery. So that just leaves us with Kuhn. So science concepts we have found so far are clustered and modular and not random. They have cores and peripheries. They simultaneously grow both outward to peripheries and inward to fill the cores. They're doing both at the same time. There's no preference of which to do first and which to do later. So could Kuhn be right? Is normal science a process of puzzle solving or of filling in knowledge gaps? Well, we wanted to ask that question a little bit more precisely by defining exactly what a knowledge gap is here. To study these gaps or cavities in the growing network topology, we use a tool from applied algebraic topology, which is known as persistent homology. And persistent homology is really helpful for us because it generalizes into n dimensions and keeps track of when a gap is created and when a gap is filled. So I want to talk through sort of what I mean by a gap. So in 0 dimensions, which is what I'm showing you right here, a gap can just be 2 disconnected nodes. There's a missing edge. So that's a very small gap, a gap in 0 dimensions. In 1 dimensions, a gap can look like a square like this that could be filled in by a node if a node was here, but is not yet filled in. And then in 2 dimensions, a gap can look like this. So this octahedron could also be filled if a node was added in the center that connected to the corners. So each of these gaps can be detected using persistent homology. And intuitively, those gaps in concept networks can be thought of as opportunities or puzzles. What is the missing part here? What would help us to understand this more fully? So in the data, which is what I'm showing you down below the schematics, what we find is that we can plot the cumulative frequency of the lifetime of gaps in real versus null model networks. And what we can see from that cumulative frequency is that gaps tend to stay open. So they are both shorter and fewer remain open here than what would be expected in an edge rewired network, which is what I'm showing you in the peach area. So what that means is that science concept networks have shorter lifetime gaps. So when the gaps form, they close really quickly. And they also have fewer open gaps at any particular time than the rewired null networks. So do we see evidence then of the normal science or the filling in of knowledge gaps that Kuhn suggests? Yes, definitely we do. Real networks both fill in gaps faster and they create fewer gaps than the random knowledge networks. But that doesn't necessarily tell us, why they're doing it that way. So the last little piece of information that I wanted to present to you is maybe a why. We can ask which contributions are most influential in science, and perhaps that will help us to understand why we fill in these gaps in this way. There are many markers of influence in science. The one that I will just show you today for simplicity is the awarding of Nobel Prizes as one measure of the influence of a concept. So we measure whether Nobel Prizes tend to be given for concepts that either start a gap or close a gap, because that would indicate to us that this connection to gaps and gap filling may be important for how we evaluate the merit of a scientific contribution. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we find that Nobel Prize winning nodes are more likely to participate in a simplex, so that's a sort of small motif in which a gap is birthed, than non-Nobel Prizes. So the Nobel Prizes are in the dark here, and the non-Nobel Prizes are in the peach here. And then we also find on the right-hand side that Nobel Prize winning nodes are more likely to participate in a simplex in which a gap is filled than non-Nobel Prize winning nodes. And that's measured by this participation in a death simplex. A death simplex is when that missing unit at the center of the octahedron or the square is filled in by a concept that connects to all the other concepts. So these data collectively suggest that influential nodes are those that are more frequently participating in either the birth or the death of cavities, suggesting that this kind of the spaces inside of the knowledge architecture are important for defining the merit of a contribution. So then just in conclusion for this bit of it, what have we learned in this study of collective curiosity? Well, in a network formulation of scientific discovery, what we're finding is that these data-driven conditions underlying breakthroughs depend as much on identifying uncharted gaps as on advancing solutions within the scientific community. So more specifically, the findings reveal that human knowledge grows by filling gaps of knowledge, perhaps driven by the collective curiosity of individual scientists, but it's both through inward exploration, closing gaps inside of the knowledge space, inside of the core, and through outward exploration, closing gaps on the edges of the knowledge space, with a gradual modification of the network structure as it proceeds. So this suggests that knowledge is discovered while creating and filling gaps, and that's likely to be more influential and more frequently awarded in the scientific community than contributions that do not connect to open gaps. The mathematical formulations that we use as we were doing this work and the historical data that we have pave the way, we think, for a better way of describing and understanding scientific process, and perhaps a way of understanding the novel contributions that are made. So just in a quick summary of the two studies and of where we began this talk, we began by thinking about both individual and collective curiosity as network building processes. And I think that that view is supported by historical philosophical examinations of the use of the term curiosity in English, French, German, and Latin over the last 2 millennia. Curiosity archetypes that are gathered from that data are evident in the ways that we browse Wikipedia. And these curious movements, even the leaping to fill in a gap, are evident in the ways that humans build scientific knowledge, as we saw in the second study. So taken together, this work provides a connective counterpoint to the common acquisitional account of curiosity in humans. With that, I'd just like to acknowledge the people who are really important in leading the work that I described today. David Leiden-Staley was the first author of the first paper. Professor Zern is the person who we worked with for the historical philosophical account of curiosity. Dale and Anne both contributed to the first analysis of Wikipedia and understanding individual curiosity. And then for the second study of collective curiosity, we added to the team. Almost everybody over here was also part of the second study, but Harong Zhu was the person who led the work. And we also brought in a wonderful collaborative team, including Judy Kaplan, who's in the history of science at the University of Pennsylvania, and also Julio Tuma, who is in the philosophy of science at the University of Pennsylvania. And they provided a really necessary understanding of and contextualization of our findings. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I'm very excited to take questions.
Thank you so much for this talk. This was really interesting. Lots of information. Made me very curious. I would give it first to the room here. Who wants to start off with a question? If anyone wants to go, please go ahead.
I have a question. So thinking about the hunter, busybody, dancer in Wikipedia, I'm curious, like, if for somebody who is a busybody or like in the kind of busybody mode, do you have a sense of how good at being a busybody they are in navigating Wikipedia? Like, are they good at finding kind of jumping topics, or is it like very trial and error, check something, oh no, that's too related, come back and find something kind of further afield?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that, I mean, we can look at the actual jumps that they made, and to us, they seem conceptually very not related. So I would say that if it's a human evaluation, they're doing a great job going between very dissimilar concepts. But I think you're probably asking for something more than just a human looking at the list. And I think what your question raises is the interesting one of a trial and error, as in I was looking for something, but that's not the right one, and I quickly changed my mind. I feel like that we could potentially test that by examining the time that they spent on pages. And if they were on a page for a long period of time, moved somewhere for a very short period of time, and then moved somewhere for a very long period of time again, it's almost as if that middle one may have been mistake. So that we could definitely look at that. We would just have to understand kind of the entropy of the time windows that they spent on each page. And we have that data, but we haven't looked at it in that way before. It'd be really interesting.
Totally fair. Thank you.
Leila, go ahead.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah, we unmuted at the same time. So thanks so much for your presentation. I have one question, which is about how much do you assess the results that you have found to be universal? If this is a question that you feel comfortable to answer. I will say a lot of the challenges that we see in our space, in like understanding Wikimedia projects and what happens on the Wikimedia projects, a good chunk of the challenges relies today on the fact that a lot of studies have heavily focused on English Wikipedia and what people do on English Wikipedia, which of course English is a relatively universal language. We have a lot of people coming in from different cultures, different backgrounds to English.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you expect what you have learned to be universal, or there are questions around potential biases in the data that are worth exploring further.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, 2 days ago, I want to say, we were talking with Judy Kaplan about that second study, and we're revising it after some comments from peer review. And she was asking the question of, could we just run the exact same analysis on German Wikipedia, which in her work, she commonly goes back and forth between the English Wikipedia and the German Wikipedia. And I thought, oh, that's a really great idea. I don't know immediately how I would go about doing that because I don't know German. But I think it would be a very nice validation of the processes that we've inferred, given at least 2 languages. That would help us to say that this is much more general. I think we started with English just because it is more universal, but I do believe looking at other languages would be an important direction to take the work.
And if I may do a quick follow-up, just to say that if you are starting to look at other languages, we would be happy to give recommendations for what languages to look at from our perspective. And I would highly recommend also looking at a language which is from the family of languages side is different than English. So perhaps looking at something like Arabic or something that is, completely in a different or geographical region, and also language family could be interesting. Anyway, we can talk more about that if you're interested at any point.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about that.
I would have a question. Before I ask that, I want to mention you can ask a question too, put it in the chat. Isaac will relay it here. And I was interested about this notion of deprivation sensitivity, that this was as I understood, like I read it a little bit in the paper, but maybe you can comment a little bit more about it, since it seemed to be a predictor of whether one is a busybody or a hunter. Mm-hmm. And my question is this somehow an intrinsic property of a person, similar to, let's say, other constructs of personality? If I think of the big 5, for example, like, is it something like openness to experience, for example? Is there a relation between those 2 things? Like, is this something fixed, or can I learn that or change that? And maybe the second part would be related to also what Isaac mentioned, is more in terms of this, like, how is this related to the life outcome or to my functioning of the world? And this could be maybe even narrower, let's say, in my ability to parse knowledge in general or understand knowledge. Yeah, so these main points.
Yeah, no, these are really, really good questions. So first, about whether deprivation sensitivity, your value of deprivation sensitivity is a trait for you and always true of you, or whether it changes. It's a really good question. The way in which these measures are created is very similar to the way the Big Five measures were created. So they are published only if, when you measure it in a person multiple times, you get very similar answers. That doesn't mean perfectly exactly the same answers, but they have to be, you know, somewhat correlated. So there has to be greater variation across individuals than within an individual over a time frame. So that's the way in which this measure was created. And so we do have some reason to believe that the value that you estimate for a person today is similar to what you will get on another day. But I would also say that there is evidence that you know, we may have variation in deprivation sensitivity as a function of environmental factors or life experiences. And so it is probably something that also changes a bit day to day as well. I actually think, if you were to ask me, like, you know, is it that people are just a busybody or just a hunter? I really think that we often use these different kinds of curiosity at different stages of an inquisitive process. So I think often when I'm at the beginning of a research project, I'm kind of the busybody. I'm like looking for ideas, and they can be really disconnected ideas, totally fine. I'm just kind of trying to be open and trying to keep my eyes open, right? And then when I get closer to an idea, I try to push it for a while in one direction, more like the hunter. And then because I like interdisciplinary work, I'll often jump over here and push over here for a little while and then try to connect the two, more like the dancer. So I feel like in the research that we do, we often move across the three signatures in a way that allows us to ask the kinds of questions that we want to ask. And I would envision that that would be true, you know, for a person walking down the street too, that each style has a different offer for us. And we may be able to learn to use each of them at different moments in time to build better. Oh, then you had a second part of that.
Maybe it relates a little bit, but about if we think about this as personality traits, we know that personality traits are related to life outcomes, like conscientiousness, for example, is very much related. So in that sense, I think you partly addressed this, but maybe you have.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, so also, I should also say that most of these measurements people have attempted to define them so that they are not super highly correlated with any other previously defined personality dimension. So it won't be perfectly correlated with open-mindedness, for example. But the fact that I do think that it is something that can be altered to some degree in each person, and certainly sort of harnessed for different kinds of tasks that we might want to engage in our lives.
Okay, thank you. Now I hear that we have a few questions from the audience. Isaac, could you?
Yep. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, this first question comes from YouTube, and they're asking about kind of what you know about a related research area. The example is for someone who's, for example, in hunter mode, is there research on how they learn to develop new ways to find the content they're seeking? So how do we learn to like seek the knowledge in these different kind of modes?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think there is definitely some work to suggest that we learn curiosity patterns from other people. So you may, you know, see a mentor in your life or a friend or a teacher who kind of shows a particular way of being curious, and then you learn that from them. You can even think of when you sit in a lecture in a classroom, or at college or high school, or, you know, wherever you might be, and you listen to it, or maybe it's TEDx talk online or whatever it is that you might be listening to a podcast. There's a way in which people speak, a way in which people walk through ideas that kind of shows a particular architecture of thought, a way of being curious. And so we can learn, humans are very adept at learning these kinds of patterns from other individuals. So I think that's one way in which it happens.
Great, that makes sense. Yeah, and one of the examples they had given was learning from watching others kind of users interact. So it sounds like thinking about similar pieces there. Great. The next question, and I'm going to read this word to word so I make sure I don't get it wrong. So using Wikipedia links as edges allows individuals to know possible nodes to walk to. However, in real life, I wouldn't assume all possible edges from a node you might be on to connected nodes is prior knowledge. In that sense, is walking along an unknown path and hoping to find a node essentially the same as acquiring more nodes, which they say is the definition of curiosity you were disputing? Is that clear or?
So I'll try to answer. So I think that it is definitely true that we have prior knowledge in our minds as we enter Wikipedia, right? So it's possible we won't click on this topic because we're an expert in that topic. Although I still learn from Wikipedia, even on topics on which I think I know something. So let's put that with a grain of salt. But then when you're walking, you are seeking new kinds of information, but you're seeking kinds of information that are related to what you currently have, unless you're using kind of a random search pattern, right? Just give me whatever randomly comes next. And so in that sense, there's still a presence of walking, still a dependence. What I walk to right now is dependent on what I came from before. And I wouldn't choose that if I had been coming from some other place in the knowledge space, right? So it's this dependence of your current action or decision on past actions that makes this connective, and that's different than the acquisitional account that has been suggested previously.
Great, thank you. I'll look back if they clarify, but I think that sounds like it's getting at the same general area. The last piece, the person says they don't recall if the participants were all desktop users, but they're curious about how device type or I think other like aspects of the UI might have been affecting the type of styles they exhibit. I think just any sort of thoughts on how,
Yeah, that's a really great question. Everybody had a laptop, and we installed it on a laptop that they brought in to Penn. So, but there were different operating systems. So I guess we could look at operating systems, but we don't have any variation in the actual device. It was all the same.
Great. I'll pass it to I think Pablo then.
Okay, thank you, Isaac. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much for this talk. It was very, very inspiring. I was not familiar with these frameworks about knowledge network building, and now I feel curious about it. So
good.
So you have been testing these approaches in knowledge infrastructure as Wikipedia, which are explicitly networked, in which like pieces of knowledge constructed by articles, they are connected by wiki links. So I'm curious about if these approaches have been tested in other infrastructures like classical encyclopedias, newspapers. I was asking this because in relation to what Leila mentions, to understand like comparing like maybe English versus other cultural spaces, I'm really curious about to comparing like networked digital spaces to traditional ones to understand the role of wiki links in the construction of knowledge and in curiosity.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are two other places where we've been studying knowledge network growth. One is in infants, in the production of words. So in understanding, when does a child start to produce this word? What other words are already in that child's vocabulary that it's related to? And how do children sort of push the boundaries of their knowledge, or do they fill in words that we feel like they should have known before given the other words they knew, right? So that's very similar to the collective knowledge network building in the second project. And what we find is that the young children definitely build knowledge gaps. So we see them kind of learn words around a space and then later fill it in. They don't learn by kind of growing from the center just outward. There are lots of loops, lots of holes, and they fill in those holes as they go along. So that's really interesting. So the kind of gappy knowledge growth is consistent between collective science in Wikipedia and infants or toddlers learning language, which is pretty neat. The second piece, I guess I would say, is that we've studied it in textbooks, mathematics textbooks for a university. So we studied 10 linear algebra textbooks, and we extracted the concepts, and then we extracted, when those concepts are placed next to one another in the exposition. That helped us to understand how this conceptual space was growing in front of the reader. And we again found these interesting knowledge gaps or cavities inside of the architecture, and we were able to link how many gaps were present with how much people liked the textbook on Goodreads. So what we found is that textbooks that have fewer gaps are more well liked. So I guess when we are choosing to learn something in a particular space, and maybe when a grade is assigned, then learning in a non-gappy way is preferred, which is interesting. But that's quite different than browsing. When I browse, I don't mind gaps. I think if I had a grade assigned to it, I would mind it more. So there are different motivations for the ways of engaging in the information.
Thank you very much.
Isaac, you want to bring a few more questions from YouTube?
Yes. A question was asked about whether it's possible to identify the type of curiosity of article creators. And in general, I think I would just extend this to how curiosity maybe affects editors and the type of work they do too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, certainly from a writer, you can take somebody's written work and you could construct something like a word co-occurrence network. So you would have words be nodes, and then you would connect them if they are within 5 to 10 words of one another. And so from that, you can have a growing network of words that it characterizes that expositional flow. And from that architecture, you can say whether that's similar to the characteristics of the busybody or of the hunter. So I would say, yes, in general, that is definitely possible to do. But for your extension, for editors of Wikipedia, I guess it depends how much they write in a given section. Because if it's like a half a sentence, it's very difficult to say or I wouldn't know how to go about saying whether that's a more busybody-like clause or a more hunter-like clause. I'd have to think about that more.
Thanks. I have one more. I'm waiting on some elaboration on it first. So if there's another question in the room, I think that's probably best.
Anyone else from the room?
Maybe I can ask a quick question. Thank you so much, Danielle, for this presentation. It's very, very beautiful. I think I'm gonna play it again all over because I'm sure I missed some things. It was very, very interesting. I'm wondering, so as a scientist, all of us are scientists, but I really, really like the second work on scientific revolutions. And I'm wondering, and I know this stems from scientific production theories, but I'm wondering to the extent to which these kind of studies could be extended to other branches of knowledge beyond science. For example, I don't know, philosophy, theology, or things like that, if you thought about it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, from a computational perspective, the answer is absolutely yes. We could do all of the exact same things on areas of the humanities, right, or the social sciences. I think it would be very interesting to do that and test the science theories, like do the humanities work in the same way that science works? But I guess I would definitely acknowledge that I'm not very familiar with theories of the growth of knowledge in the humanities. So if there's a separate set of philosophers we need to be studying and examining their theories, that part I don't know, and would probably want to reach out to people who work in that space. So I would make sure to examine additional theories if it would be helpful. But certainly there's nothing stopping anyone from doing the exact same thing we did here in areas of the humanities. I think that would be fascinating. I feel like the social dynamics are so different, though, between science and, let's say, philosophy, that I would imagine we would see different architectures. I would love to know how different.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, I know relatively little about humanities. There are some branches of humanities that could have some similar processes, but yeah, if this study could be replicated, I think that would be very interesting. All right, thank you.
I think final question from IRC. I think I got some elaboration. They were asking about whether you could elaborate more on links with cognitive science and neuroscience. And I think in particular, thinking about curiosity and what some of these other fields have to say on, like fMRI studies, for instance, in neuroscience. Like, do you know much about, I guess, the background there around curiosity and how it shows up in those ways?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, in the cognitive neuroscience of curiosity, there are two circuits that are commonly identified in fMRI studies as being relevant for curiosity. One is the reward circuit. So that's a circuit of brain areas that is very involved in helping us appreciate that we find something rewarding. And it's activated when we obtain something we wanted. So in this case, if we're searching for a piece of information and then we finally get that piece of information, there's a big activation of reward circuitry at that moment. And then the second circuit that is involved is the cognitive control circuit that guides our attention and helps us to not be distracted by other things when we're trying to find a piece of information, or allows us to be distracted. It kind of opens up the blinders and says, oh, go ahead, look whatever you want to do, wherever you want to look. And so that kind of control over your attention and the focus of attention is something that is a circuit that's very important as we engage in different kinds of information search. So I think connecting that with the first study, we'd really like to do the Wikipedia browsing study inside of a scanner so that we can see, as people are moving between similar pages or dissimilar pages, how much is each circuit being activated, and could we better understand each of those decisions from the neural circuitry. I think that would be really neat. We haven't done that yet. It's hard there's some technical difficulties, but that would be a fun one.
Yeah, I really like the idea of like my circuitry like sparking every time I open up a Wikipedia article. Now I'm going to think about that.
Yeah.
Curiosity being rewarded. I did have, does anyone else in the room questions? I've talked a lot, otherwise I have a final question. Yeah, so my kind of getting back to the product side. So in Wikipedia, for instance, there's a recent feature called page previews, where if you hover over a link, you can see like a little snapshot of that page, and it has like an image and kind of a paragraph of text. And as I think about that, I think, oh, like for a busybody, that would be fantastic, right? You don't have to click through. You can just like, you can visit all the pages like very quickly, right? And then I was thinking about for like the dancer and the hunter, whether you had thought at all about like, UI or like kind of product pieces that would help satisfy those sorts of curiosity patterns more. And maybe just Wikipedia is that, but I just was curious if you had any product recommendations in those veins.
That's really interesting. Well, I think I think each of us, or at different times, might have preferences for the distance between concepts that we like, and when I'm interested in just finding out anything, I don't really want a random, take me from here and take me randomly to something else. I want something that is like a teeny bit related enough that I can mentally be like, oh yeah, there's some connection there, but it's so far away that I wouldn't usually think of it. And there's something about that, like farther than I would typically think, but I can still see the connection, that's very satisfying to me. So if there was a way of like making suggestions that are that distance, I would love it. I don't know if other people would, but that would be fun to me.
See what we can do.
Can I jump in? I want to say something which is related to this. I think as you were speaking, Danielle, I was thinking about the search experience on Wikipedia. And this would be a kind of a prime example of a place that such recommendations can be tested, in the sense that generally search engines return to you things that are very similar to what you're looking for. And a challenging task would be, show me something which is farther away that I would never even think about, but then there's kind of a connection to it. And it would be interesting to see how that can potentially transform the search experience and the way people engage with content.
Yeah. That's such a good idea.
Great. I think with this, we can close the stream for today. There's nothing on YouTube or IRC anymore. Thank you so much, Danielle, for this talk and hanging around for the discussion so long. This was lots of really good questions and lots of really good answers and thoughts. And thank you for the inspiring talk. Thank you everyone for joining the talk and engaging in that discussion. That was really great to see. Also people in the room, but also on YouTube and on IRC. Thanks for Jana and Emerald for the support, technical and administrative. So we can run this here. When we end the stream, we close down, but people here in the room feel free to stay around for a few minutes or longer. And with this, I wish everyone a good rest of the day or start a new day wherever you are. I hope you enjoyed it and see you for the next showcase in May. Bye.